Sometimes the smallest acts of courage come from the most desperate hearts. In a world where children learned early that kindness was a luxury few could afford, one little girl would risk everything on the hope that even the most feared man might have room for mercy. Askel the Bear was a giant among Vikings, his reputation forged in blood and battle. After years of raiding and conquest, he had retreated to his blacksmith forge, seeking solitude from the ghosts of his past. Then 8-year-old Ylsa appeared at his door, orphaned, hungry, and too proud to beg. Instead, she offered him work. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But could a child's simple request truly heal a warrior's wounded soul? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord, like the memory of old sorrows, rising from waters so still they mirrored the towering cliffs above. In this remote corner of Norway, where the 9th century moved at the pace of seasons rather than heartbeats, the village of Skarvik had learned to measure time by the rhythm of Askel's hammer against anvil. The sound echoed across the settlement now, steady and methodical, each strike resonating through the wooden walls of modest homes and into the bones of those who dwelt within them. It was a sound that both comforted and unsettled. Comforted because it spoke of industry and purpose. Unsettled because it reminded them all of the man who made it. Askel the Bear stood in his forge like a mountain given human form, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow of the fire. 7 feet of scarred muscle and weathered skin, he moved with the deliberate grace of a predator who had learned patience through necessity. His hands, large enough to crush a man's skull, worked the red-hot iron with surprising delicacy, shaping it into the tools and weapons that kept the village fed and protected. Above the forge, mounted on pegs driven deep into the oak beam, hung his warhammer, a weapon that had once split shields and shattered bones from the Irish coast to the gates of Constantinople. Now it gathered dust and spiderwebs, a relic of a life he had chosen to leave behind. The leather grip was still worn smooth from his hands. The iron head still bore the nicks and scratches of 100 battles. But it had not tasted blood in 5 years. 5 years since he had returned to Skarvik. 5 years since he had traded the deck of a longship for the floor of a forge. The villagers still whispered about those early days, when he would wake screaming in the night, when the sound of children laughing would send him into dark moods that lasted for days. They whispered about the scars that covered his arms and chest, about the way his left hand sometimes trembled when he thought no one was looking, about the nights when they could see him walking the cliff paths until dawn, but they had grown used to him, as people do to the rhythm of tides or the turning of seasons. He kept to himself, spoke little, and asked for nothing beyond the right to work his trade in peace. In return, he kept their tools sharp, their wagon wheels round, and their children safe from the wolves that sometimes descended from the mountains in winter. The village itself was a humble collection of longhouses and workshops, built where the fjord narrowed into a river that provided fresh water and a path inland. Fishing boats bobbed at anchor in the protected harbour, their painted eyes staring out toward the open sea. Gardens struggled against the short-growing season, coaxed into productivity by the careful hands of women who understood that one failed harvest could mean starvation. It was into this world that Ylsa had been born 8 winters ago, when the northern lights had danced green and gold across the sky for 7 straight nights. Her mother, Sigrid, had been a weaver of uncommon skill, her fingers able to coax patterns from wool that seemed to tell stories of their own. Her father, Bjorn, had been a fisherman blessed with an uncanny ability to read the moods of the sea. They had been a happy family, neither wealthy nor poor, content with their place in the careful balance of village life. Ylsa had inherited her mother's quick fingers and her father's intuitive understanding of natural rhythms. By the age of 5, she could mend a net with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. By 6, she could predict the weather by the way the gulls flew and the color of the evening sky. Then came the plague. It arrived with a trader from the south, a man who complained of nothing more than a persistent cough and a mild fever. Within a week, that cough had spread through the village like wildfire through dry grass. Within a month, 17 souls had been claimed, including both of Ylsa's parents. She had nursed them through their final days with a stoicism that broke the hearts of those who witnessed it. Fetching water and broth, changing soiled bedding, and singing the old songs her mother had taught her. When the fever finally took them, she had closed their eyes with her own small hands and sat vigil through the night as custom demanded. The village had tried to do right by her. Elder Thorvald had approached the other families, seeking someone willing to take in an orphaned child. But times were hard, and an extra mouth to feed was a burden few could afford. More challenging still was Ylsa's reputation for stubbornness and what the women called too much mouth, a tendency to ask difficult questions and offer opinions that were deemed inappropriate for a child. Especially a female child. She needs a firm hand, declared Astrid, the baker's wife, after Ylsa had corrected her counting of the day's loaves. And someone with patience for her contrary ways. She's clever enough, admitted Gunnar the fisherman, but cleverness in a girl can be more curse than blessing. She'll never find a husband if she doesn't learn to hold her tongue, so Ylsa had been passed from household to household like an unwanted burden, staying a few days here, a week there, never quite fitting into the rhythms of other people's lives. She tried to make herself useful, sweeping floors, tending fires, helping with the endless tasks that kept her household running, but there was always something. She worked too slowly for the hurried pace of the miller's family, too quickly for the deliberate rhythms of the widow Helga's home. She asked too many questions for some, not enough for others. Gradually, the offers of temporary shelter became fewer and farther between. Ylsa found herself sleeping in the storage loft of the grain house, wrapped in a threadbare cloak that had been her mother's, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of someone who remembered her parents with fondness. It was during those lonely weeks that she first began to truly notice Askel the Bear. The forge stood apart from the other buildings, positioned where the prevailing winds would carry the smoke away from the village, but close enough that the sound of his work formed a steady heartbeat in the daily life of Skarvik. Ylsa would often find reasons to pass by, drawn by the hypnotic dance of sparks and the rhythmic percussion of metal on metal. From a safe distance, she would watch him work. There was something mesmerizing about the way his massive frame moved around the forge, each gesture economical and purposeful. She watched him heat iron until it glowed like a piece of the sun itself, then shape it with precise blows that seemed to coax rather than force the metal into the desired form. She saw the way he would pause sometimes, holding a piece up to the light, examining it with the critical eye of an artist, before returning it to the fire for further refinement. But it was more than his skill that fascinated her. It was the solitude he carried around himself like armor, the way he seemed to exist apart from the social currents that governed village life. He spoke to no one unless spoken to first, conducted his business with quiet efficiency, and disappeared into his workshop as soon as his dealings with the outside world were complete. The other children whispered stories about him, tales of battles fought in distant lands, of enemies crushed beneath his mighty hammer, of ships loaded with treasure and glory. They dared each other to approach his forge, but none ever did. The bravest among them might venture close enough to peer through the doorway before running away, breathless with the thrill of their own audacity. Ylsa was different. She didn't run. Instead, she would position herself where she could observe without being seen, studying the man who had become the village's most intriguing mystery. She noticed things the others missed, the way his left hand sometimes shook when he reached for his tools, the careful ritual he performed each morning before lighting his forge fire, the nights when lamplight would burn in his workshop until dawn. Most of all, she noticed the sadness that clung to him like morning fog, so deep and pervasive that it had become part of his very being. It was a sadness she recognized, having felt its cold touch herself in the long nights after her parents' death. It spoke to something in her own wounded heart, creating a connection she didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The village had its opinions about Askel, of course. The older men, veterans of their own smaller battles, regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness. They had heard enough stories to know that a man didn't earn the epithet the Bear through gentleness, and they were content to let sleeping wolves lie. The women crossed themselves when they spoke of him, remembering bloodier times and darker stories. The children made him into a figure of legend, terrible and magnificent in equal measure. But Ylsa saw past the legends to the man beneath. She saw the way he would pause in his work when the wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the village square, his face taking on an expression of such profound longing that it made her chest ache. She saw how he would sometimes stand in his doorway at sunset, looking out toward the fjord, with eyes that seemed to be searching for something that would never return. She saw, in short, a kindred spirit, another soul carrying the weight of loss, another heart learning to beat in rhythm with solitude. As autumn deepened into the first whispers of winter, as the fishing boats were pulled up onto the beach for the season, and the last of the harvest was stored away against the coming cold, Ylsa's situation grew more desperate. The temporary shelters had all but dried up, and she found herself spending more nights in the grain storage than in anyone's home. It was during one of those cold, lonely nights that she made her decision. She would approach Askel the Bear not as a child seeking charity, but as one person offering another a fair exchange. She had watched him long enough to see that he lived alone, that his home consisted of nothing more than a small room attached to the forge, furnished with only the barest necessities. She had observed that he prepared his own simple meals over the forge fire, ate from a single wooden bowl, and wore clothes that were clean but showed signs of inexpert mending. Here, she realized, was a man who might have need of the skills she possessed. And here, perhaps, was her chance to prove that she could be useful enough to earn her place in the world. The decision made, she began to plan. She would not approach him as a beggar or a burden, but as a person offering valuable services in exchange for shelter and sustenance. She would present herself with dignity, speak clearly and honestly, and trust that her offer would be judged on its merits rather than dismissed because of her age or circumstances. As she lay in the grain loft that final night, listening to the wind howl around the eaves and feeling the first bite of true winter in the air, Ylsa rehearsed the words she would say. Simple words, honest words, words that offered hope instead of demanding pity. I can cook and clean. 4 words that would change everything. The morning Ylsa chose to approach Askel dawned grey and bitter, with frost painting the ground white and the harbour glazed with a thin skin of ice. She had risen before the village stirred, when the only sounds were the distant cry of gulls and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the ash trees that surrounded the settlement. She had prepared herself as best she could, washing her face and hands with water so cold it made her gasp, combing her tangled hair with her fingers, and brushing the straw from her mother's old cloak. The garment was too large for her small frame, its hem dragging in the mud. But it was all she had left of the woman who had taught her that dignity was something that came from within, not from the richness of one's clothing. Her stomach growled with hunger, but she ignored it. She had grown accustomed to the hollow feeling, had learned to function despite the constant reminder of her body's needs. Today, she told herself, would be the last day she would go to sleep hungry. Today would mark the beginning of a different life. The forge stood silent as she approached, no smoke rising from its chimney, no glow emanating from its doorway. For a moment doubt crept into her heart. Perhaps Askel had left the village, gone on some journey that would keep him away for days or weeks. Perhaps she had waited too long to make her move. Then she heard it, the soft scrape of a blade against leather, the rhythmic sound of someone sharpening a tool. Following the noise around to the side of the building, she found him seated on a low stool, working a whetstone along the edge of an axe with the patient concentration of a man who understood that a dull blade was more dangerous than no blade at all. In the grey morning light, he seemed even larger than he had from a distance, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sky, his hands making the axe handle look like a toy. His hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a simple knot, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his solitary lifestyle. He wore a simple tunic of undyed wool and leather breeches that had seen better days, but there was nothing humble about his presence. He carried himself with the unconscious authority of a man who had commanded others in life and death situations. Ylsa stood at the edge of his vision, gathering her courage. This close to him, she could see the scars that marked his arms and hands, thin white lines that spoke of blade work, puckered circles that told of arrow wounds, and one particularly nasty mark that ran from his left temple to his jaw. These were the souvenirs of a violent life, she realized, the permanent reminders of battles fought and survived. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Askel continued his work, the steel singing against the stone, while Ylsa struggled to find the words she had rehearsed so carefully. In the cold light of morning, facing the reality of his imposing presence, her planned speech seemed suddenly inadequate. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky. There was no hostility in his gaze, but no warmth either, just the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. "You're Bjorn's daughter," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It wasn't a question. "I am," Ylsa replied, pleased that her voice came out steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "You've been watching me." Again, not a question. Heat rose in her cheeks, but she didn't deny it. "Yes." He set down the axe and whetstone, giving her his full attention. The weight of his regard was almost physical, like standing too close to the forge fire. "Why?" The simple question demanded a simple answer, but the truth was anything but simple. How could she explain the connection she felt, the recognition of shared loneliness, the hope that had grown slowly over weeks of observation? "Because you're alone," she said finally. "Like me?" Something shifted in his expression, so subtle she might have missed it if she hadn't been studying his face so intently. It was there and gone in an instant, a flicker of surprise perhaps, or recognition. "I choose to be alone," he said. "I know." Ylsa took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the frost-covered ground. "But that doesn't mean you have to do everything yourself." She could see him processing her words, trying to determine what she wanted from him. His eyes traveled from her tangled hair to her mud-stained cloak to her bare feet, and she saw the exact moment when he understood her circumstances. "The village has no place for you," he said. It was a statement, not a question, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "No." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "But I can make my own place. Can you now?" There was the faintest hint of something that might have been amusement in his voice. "And how do you propose to do that?" This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. Ylsa straightened her shoulders and spoke the words that would change both their lives. "I can cook and clean," she said, her voice carrying across the morning air with absolute certainty. "I can mend clothes and tend fires. I can help you in the forge, carry water, work the bellows, organize your tools. I'm small enough to get into spaces you can't reach, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Askel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what would you want in return?" "A place to sleep," she said simply. "Food enough to keep my strength up. Nothing more. Nothing more." He repeated her words as if testing their weight. "Just like that?" "Just like that." He was silent for so long that Ylsa began to wonder if he had decided to ignore her entirely, to simply return to his work and pretend she had never appeared. She could see him weighing her offer, calculating the complications it might bring to his carefully ordered solitude. "I'm not a kind man," he said finally. "I don't have patience for teaching or for the sorts of conversations that women seem to enjoy. I work hard, I speak little, and I value quiet above most things. I'm not looking for kindness, Ylsa replied. I'm looking for fairness. Fairness. He picked up the axe again, testing its edge against his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared, and he wiped it absently on his tunic. The village thinks I'm dangerous. They tell stories about me, some of them true, some of them not. If you stay here, they'll talk about you too. They already talk about me. Not the same kind of talk. Ylsa considered this. She had heard enough whispered conversations to know that Askel's reputation was built on violence and bloodshed, that he was regarded with a mixture of fear and fascination. To associate herself with him would mark her as different, perhaps permanently, but different from what? From the people who had passed her from house to house like an unwanted burden? From the community that had decided she was too difficult, too opinionated, too much trouble to be worth helping? Let them talk, she said. For the first time since their conversation began, Askel smiled, a barely perceptible lifting of the corners of his mouth that transformed his entire face. In that moment she caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before war and loss had carved their marks into his features. "You're certain about this?" he asked. "Once you cross that threshold, there's no going back to the way things were. The village will see you differently. They'll assume things about you, about us, that may not be true. The way things were wasn't working," Ylsa said. "I'd rather be talked about than ignored." He nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. Standing, he towered over her, his shadow falling across her like the darkness of a mountain. "Very well," he said, "but we do this properly. I'll speak to Elder Thorvald, make the arrangement official. You'll work for your keep. No charity, no special treatment because of your age. If you can't pull your weight, you're gone. Understood?" "Understood." "And Ylsa!" The sound of her name in his deep voice sent a strange shiver through her. "Leave your past at the door. In my home you start fresh," she nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. What she did understand was that her life had just taken a dramatic turn, that the lonely child who had approached his forge that morning was already becoming someone different. As Askel gathered his tools and prepared to begin his day's work, Ylsa stood in the doorway of the forge and looked back at the village where she had been born and raised. From this distance, it looked small and peaceful, smoke rising from breakfast fires, people beginning to emerge from their homes to face another day. She was no longer part of that world, she realized. Whatever came next, she would face it as something new, not an orphan begging for scraps of compassion, but a person with a purpose, a place, and a future that was hers to shape. The leather pouch that had belonged to Askel's daughter sat on a shelf in the corner of his modest quarters, untouched for 5 years and gathering dust like a forgotten prayer. Inside were the treasures of a child's world. Smooth stones from the beach, a carved wooden horse with one leg missing, and a small iron key that no longer had a lock to open. It was this pouch that Askel found himself staring at on Ylsa's first morning in his home, wondering what madness had possessed him to let a child cross his threshold once again. The arrangement with Elder Thorvald had been surprisingly straightforward. The old man had listened to Askel's proposal with raised eyebrows, but no real surprise. After all, the village had been struggling with what to do about Ylsa for weeks. That Askel the Bear would offer a solution, even an unconventional one, was perhaps inevitable. The gods, Thorvald had observed with a wry smile, often worked in mysterious ways. Now, as pale morning light filtered through the single window of his workshop, Askel watched Ylsa examine her new surroundings with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. She moved through the small space like a careful animal in unfamiliar territory, noting the location of tools, the organization of materials, the rhythms that governed this masculine domain. His living quarters were sparse by any standard, a narrow bed with rough woolen blankets, a single chair beside a small table, shelves that held his few possessions. There was no feminine touch here, no softness to ease the hard edges of a warrior's life. The walls bore no decorations, save for the warhammer mounted above the forge, and the only concession to comfort was a thick bearskin rug that covered the cold stone floor. "Where should I sleep?" Ylsa asked, her voice matter-of-fact despite the magnitude of the question. Askel gestured toward a corner where he had hastily arranged a pile of clean straw covered with an old cloak. It was a poor substitute for a proper bed, but it was warm and dry, more than she had enjoyed in recent weeks. "This will be fine," she said, running her small hands over the makeshift bedding. "Better than fine." Her acceptance of such humble accommodations stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. When was the last time he had seen gratitude for such simple things? When had he himself stopped noticing the difference between adequate and comfortable? "You'll need proper clothes," he observed, taking in her worn dress and the cloak that had clearly belonged to a much larger woman. "And shoes, before the real cold comes." Ylsa looked down at her bare feet, then back at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Practical acceptance mixed with quiet determination. "I can earn them," she said. "You'll need them to work effectively," he replied, more gruffly than he intended. "It's not charity, it's good sense." Their first full day together established the rhythms that would govern their unusual household. Askel began his work at dawn, as was his custom, lighting the forge fire with practiced efficiency and setting his tools in order for the day's tasks. Ylsa watched from a respectful distance, learning without being taught the careful choreography of his craft. When he paused to break his fast with a simple meal of bread and dried fish, she appeared at his elbow with hot tea brewed from herbs she had somehow procured. The drink was perfectly prepared, not too strong, not too weak, flavored with just enough honey to cut the bitterness. He said nothing, but he noticed. As the morning progressed, she began to make herself useful in small ways. She swept the floor of the forge, organizing metal shavings and debris into neat piles for disposal. She refilled his water bucket without being asked, positioned tools within easy reach as he worked, and maintained the steady rhythm of the bellows when he needed both hands free for delicate work. Most remarkable of all, she did these things in silence. Askel had grown accustomed to solitude, had come to treasure the quiet that allowed him to focus completely on his craft. He had expected a child's presence to shatter that peace with constant chatter, questions, and the inevitable demands for attention that young people seem to require. Instead, Ylsa moved through his space like a shadow, anticipating his needs and fulfilling them without disrupting the meditative flow of his work. It was only when Gunnar the fisherman arrived with a broken needle that Askel realized how naturally she had integrated herself into his routine. "Askel," Gunnar called from the doorway, his eyes immediately finding Ylsa and widening with surprise. "I heard rumors, but I didn't quite believe them." "The needle?" Askel replied, extending his hand without looking up from the blade he was shaping. Gunnar handed over the tool, but his attention remained fixed on Ylsa, who continued her work as if the visitor didn't exist. "She's really staying here?" "She works here," Askel corrected, his voice carrying a note of warning that most villagers had learned to heed. "Right." Gunnar cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, the needle's bent, not broken. Should be a simple fix." Askel examined the tool, noting the way the metal had been stressed. 2 days, he said. 2 days, Gunnar agreed, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he continued to study Ylsa with the uncomfortable fascination of someone witnessing something unprecedented. "Does she talk?" "When she has something worth saying," Ylsa answered for herself, not looking up from the anvil she was cleaning. Gunnar's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. Behind his surprise, Askel caught a glimpse of something else, approval perhaps, or respect for the child's directness. "Well then," Gunnar said after a moment, "I suppose that's all any of us can ask for." After the fisherman left, Askel found himself studying his new assistant with fresh eyes. The easy way she had handled Gunnar's curiosity, the lack of either defiance or submission in her response, suggested a maturity that went far beyond her 8 years. She had not sought to hide behind him or to make herself smaller in the face of adult scrutiny. Instead, she had simply been herself, direct, practical, and unashamed. As the day wore on, other visitors arrived with work for the smith. Word of Ylsa's presence had clearly spread through the village, and more than one person found reasons to stop by the forge that had nothing to do with metalwork. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: surprise at seeing the child, curiosity about the arrangement, and Ylsa's calm, matter-of-fact responses to their unspoken questions. "She's not what I expected," admitted Astrid, the baker's wife, after delivering a loaf of fresh bread that was ostensibly payment for a knife sharpening, but was clearly an excuse to satisfy her curiosity. Askel grunted non-committally, but privately he was beginning to agree. The sullen, difficult child he had heard described by various villagers bore little resemblance to the quietly competent person now organizing his tool rack with systematic precision. As evening approached and the last visitor departed, Askel found himself facing a challenge he hadn't anticipated. For 5 years, his evenings had followed an unvarying routine: a simple meal eaten in solitude, perhaps an hour of quiet work on personal projects, then sleep. The presence of another person, even one as undemanding as Ylsa, disrupted the familiar pattern in ways both subtle and profound. "I can prepare supper," she offered. As if sensing his uncertainty, he nodded, grateful to delay the awkward moment of trying to make conversation with a child. But as he watched her move around the small cooking area with practiced efficiency, building up the fire and setting water to boil, he realized that the evening might not be as difficult as he had feared. She worked with the same quiet competence she had shown throughout the day, and the simple stew she produced from dried meat and vegetables was better than anything he had managed on his own in months. They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of gulls settling for the night. It was only as they prepared for sleep that Askel felt the full weight of what he had done. As Ylsa settled onto her makeshift bed in the corner, wrapping herself in the old cloak with the practiced efficiency of someone who had grown accustomed to making do with little, he found himself remembering another child who had once slept in this room. The wooden doll had been carved from a piece of drift oak, its face smoothed by countless small fingers, and its simple dress faded from years of loving attention. It lay now at the bottom of a storage chest in Askel's quarters, buried beneath old clothes and forgotten tools, a relic of joy that had become too painful to look upon. But on Ylsa's 3rd morning in his home, as she quietly organized his belongings with the methodical care that had become her signature, she discovered it. Askel was at the forge, working on a commission for a wealthy trader, a set of decorative hinges that required delicate scrollwork and precise measurements. The repetitive nature of the task allowed his mind to wander, and he found himself listening to the soft sounds of Ylsa moving through his living space. She had proven remarkably adept at improving the organization of his household without disrupting the fundamental order he required for peace of mind. The silence that suddenly fell from the direction of his quarters was so complete that it pulled his attention from his work. Setting down his tools, he moved quietly to the doorway that separated his workspace from his living area. Ylsa knelt beside the open storage chest, the wooden doll cradled in her small hands. She held it with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of cherished things, her fingers tracing the worn features with gentle curiosity. There was no presumption in her posture, no sense that she was violating his privacy, only the careful attention of a person who had learned to read the stories that objects could tell. Her name was Astrid, Askel said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. Ylsa looked up at him without startlement, as if she had sensed his presence before he spoke. "She was your daughter." It wasn't a question. The resemblance between the doll and others Ylsa had seen in the village, the careful craftsmanship that spoke of a parent's love, the placement among his most personal possessions, all of it told a story that needed no explanation. She was. He leaned against the doorframe, his massive bulk filling the opening. 7 years old when the fever took her, along with her mother, The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight of grief that had grown heavier rather than lighter with the passage of years. Ylsa continued to hold the doll, but her attention was focused entirely on Askel's face, reading the pain there, with an understanding that seemed far beyond her years. What was she like? Ylsa asked. The question caught him off guard. In the 5 years since Astrid's death, no one had asked him about his daughter as a person, rather than as a tragedy to be mourned, or a loss to be pitied. The villagers had offered their condolences, their sympathy, their awkward attempts at comfort, but none had wanted to hear about the child she had actually been. Curious, he said after a long moment. Too curious for her own good sometimes. She wanted to understand how everything worked. Why the fire burned, why the metal changed shape when heated, why the hammer made such a satisfying sound against the anvil. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She asked so many questions that her mother used to joke that she would wear out the words themselves from overuse. Ylsa nodded, her expression thoughtful. My mother said the same thing about me. Did she now? Askel found himself studying the child with renewed interest. And what sorts of questions did you ask? Everything. Ylsa's answer was immediate and unapologetic. Why the tide came in and went out. Why some people had blue eyes and others had brown. Why the bread rose when you added yeast but fell if you opened the oven too soon. Why some winters were harder than others. And did you get answers? Sometimes. When people had the patience to explain, her fingers continued their gentle exploration of the doll's features. Not everyone likes questions from children, especially not from girls. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had learned to navigate the world as it was, rather than as she might wish it to be. But Askel heard the underlying message clearly enough. Here was another questioning child, another mind that hungered for understanding and had been told too often to be satisfied with silence. Would you like me to put this back? Ylsa asked, lifting the doll slightly. Askel considered the question, surprised to find that the sight of his daughter's toy in another child's hands didn't cause the sharp stab of pain he had expected. Instead, he felt something almost like relief, as if a burden he had been carrying alone was finally being shared. You can keep it where you can see it, he said. If you'd like. Ylsa's eyes widened slightly. Are you certain? I'm certain that it was meant to be held by a child's hands, he replied. And I'm certain that my daughter would have liked you. The words surprised him with their truth. Astrid had possessed the same quiet competence, the same practical intelligence that he was beginning to recognize in Ylsa. She would have appreciated the younger girl's lack of silly chatter, her willingness to work alongside adults without demanding constant attention or praise. As the days passed, a routine began to establish itself that felt both foreign and familiar. Ylsa's presence in his home created rhythms that he hadn't experienced since his family's death. The sound of someone else moving about in the early morning, the comfort of shared meals, the quiet companionship of working alongside another person who understood the value of purposeful silence. She proved to be an apt pupil when he began teaching her the simpler aspects of metalwork. Her small hands were perfect for detailed work, and she had an intuitive understanding of the way heat and pressure could transform raw materials into useful objects. More than that, she asked the right questions, not the idle curiosity of a child seeking entertainment, but the focused inquiries of someone genuinely interested in mastering a skill. Why do you heat it 3 times instead of once? She asked one afternoon, watching him work on a complex lock mechanism. Because the metal has a memory, he replied, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. Each heating changes its character slightly. Heat it too much at once, and it becomes brittle. Too little, and it won't hold the shape you give it. 3 times allows you to guide it gradually toward what you want it to become. Like people, Ylsa observed thoughtfully. He looked at her sharply, surprised by the insight. Explain. People can change, but not all at once. It takes time and patience and the right kind of pressure applied at the right moments. Push too hard too fast and they break. Too gentle and they stay the same. The wisdom in her words made him pause his work entirely. Here was a child who had been shaped by circumstances that would have broken many adults. Yet she spoke of change and growth with the understanding of someone who had witnessed both transformation and destruction. "You're right," he said simply. Very much like people, as winter deepened around them, bringing shorter days and longer nights by the fire, Askel began to understand that his life was being transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years was slowly giving way to something he barely dared to name. Not happiness, exactly, but a sense of purpose that extended beyond the simple satisfaction of craftsmanship well done. And late at night, when the wind howled around the forge and the fire burned low, he would sometimes catch himself listening for the sound of small, steady breathing from the corner where Ylsa slept, finding in that gentle rhythm a peace he had thought lost forever. The silver pendant lay hidden beneath Askel's sleeping furs, wrapped in oiled leather and bound with a cord that had frayed from years of anxious handling. It was the last gift he had given his wife Ingrid before departing on what would prove to be his final raid, a delicate piece worked by the finest silversmiths in Hedeby, depicting the tree of life with intricate knotwork that caught the light like captured moonbeams. He had planned to give it to her upon his return, along with his promise to leave the warrior's life behind. Instead, he had returned to find her grave marker in a world forever changed. 3 weeks had passed since Ylsa had taken up residence in his forge. 3 weeks that had settled into a rhythm more comfortable than Askel had dared hope. The child, for despite her obvious maturity, she was still that, had proven herself capable far beyond her years. She could work the bellows with steady precision, organize his tools with an efficiency that actually improved his productivity, and prepare meals that transformed his simple ingredients into something approaching actual cuisine. More surprising still was the way she had begun to fill the silence that had been his constant companion. Not with idle chatter or the attention-seeking noise he had expected from a child, but with observations and questions that revealed a mind both curious and disciplined. The iron from the bog works differently than the iron from the mountain, she had noted the previous evening, watching him examine a batch of raw metal that had arrived with the last trader before winter's full arrival. How so? He had asked, curious about her reasoning. The bog iron is softer when you first heat it, but it holds an edge better once it's been worked properly. The mountain iron is harder to shape but more predictable. She had paused, considering her words carefully. It's like the difference between people who grew up with hardship and people who grew up with plenty. The first kind bends more easily at first, but they're stronger in the end. Such insights had become commonplace, and Askel found himself looking forward to their quiet conversations in the evenings when the day's work was done, and they sat by the fire, she mending clothes or working on small projects while he maintained his tools or planned the next day's tasks. But tonight was different. Tonight, Ylsa sat with unusual stillness, the wooden doll that had become her evening companion resting forgotten in her lap while she stared into the flames with an expression of deep concern. "What troubles you?" Askel asked, setting aside the blade he'd been sharpening. Ylsa was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her weighing her words with the careful precision she brought to all her tasks. Finally, she spoke. "The village children came to the forge today while you were delivering the plowshares to Farmer Eric." Askel felt a familiar tension settle between his shoulders. He had wondered when this would happen, when the relative isolation of their arrangement would be tested by outside forces. What did they want? "To see me, I think. To understand why I'm here with you instead of—" She trailed off, her fingers unconsciously stroking the doll's worn wooden features. "Instead of where?" he prompted gently. "Instead of wherever unwanted children are supposed to go." The matter-of-fact way she spoke of herself as unwanted struck him like a physical blow. In the weeks since she had arrived, He had begun to forget the circumstances that had brought her to his door, had started to think of her simply as part of his daily existence, rather than a child who had been rejected by an entire community. "What did you tell them?" "That I work here, that I earn my place." Her voice was steady, but he could see the uncertainty in her posture, the way she held herself as if preparing for disappointment or rejection. "And how did they respond?" Ylsa's laugh was bitter beyond her years. "They said you only kept me because I reminded you of your dead daughter. They said everyone knows you're not right in the head since you came back from your raiding days, and that you'll probably get tired of me, just like everyone else did." Rage built in Askel's chest, like pressure in a forge bellows, hot and dangerous and demanding release. The idea that children, barely older than Ylsa herself, would speak to her with such casual cruelty made his hands curl into fists that could easily crush. Skulls. But beneath the anger was something even more disturbing. The fear that the children might be right. Not about his mental state, which he knew to be sound despite his battles with grief and memory, but about his motivations for taking Ylsa in. Had he truly seen her potential as a person, or had he simply been responding to the echo of loss that resonated between them? "Is that what you believe?" he asked carefully. Ylsa looked up at him then, her young face serious in the firelight. "No," she said with quiet certainty. "I think you kept me because you're a good man who was tired of being alone. I think I remind you of your daughter sometimes, but not in the way they meant. I think you see me as myself, not as a replacement for someone else." Her words hit him with unexpected force, mainly because they contained a truth he hadn't fully acknowledged even to himself. Yes, there were moments when Ylsa's laugh, or the way she concentrated on a difficult task, brought memories of Astrid flooding back. But they weren't painful memories. They were warm ones, gentle reminders of joy, rather than sharp stabs of loss. "You're right," he said simply. "On all counts." She nodded, as if his confirmation was expected rather than desperately needed. "But it still hurts when they say those things. Not because I believe them, but because," she struggled to find the words, "because you had hoped for acceptance rather than more judgment." "Yes." Askel set aside his tools entirely and turned to face her fully. "Ylsa, listen to me carefully. There will always be people who need to diminish others in order to feel better about themselves. The children who came here today, they're not cruel by nature, but they're repeating things they've heard from adults who don't understand what they're seeing." What are they seeing? Something that challenges their assumptions about how the world works. A child who found a way to thrive without following the usual paths. An arrangement that benefits everyone involved, but doesn't fit the traditional patterns they're comfortable with. He leaned forward, his voice taking on the weight of conviction. They're seeing proof that there are other ways to live, other ways to find family and purpose and belonging. And that scares them, because it means they might have to question their own choices. Ylsa considered this, her intelligent eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "So what do I do when they come back?" "Because they will come back. You continue to be exactly who you are," Askel replied. "You do your work well, you speak the truth, and you remember that your worth isn't determined by their opinion of you. And if any of them step foot on this property again with the intention of causing you distress, they'll answer to me." The quiet certainty in his voice seemed to settle something in Ylsa's posture. She sat up straighter, and for the first time since their conversation began, she smiled. "They said one other thing," she added, almost as an afterthought. "What was that?" "They said you were teaching me to fight like a man because you were trying to turn me into the son you never had." She looked up at him with genuine curiosity. "Are you?" Askel considered the question seriously. It was true that he had begun teaching her more than just basic metalworking, how to properly grip a hammer for maximum leverage, how to position her body to avoid injury during heavy work, how to judge the heat of metal by its color and the sound it made against the anvil. But was he trying to make her into something she wasn't? "I'm teaching you to be strong," he said finally. "Strong in body, strong in mind, strong in spirit. Whether that makes you more like a man or more like a woman isn't my concern. What matters is that you become capable of taking care of yourself and others who might need your help." Ylsa nodded solemnly, as if he had just revealed some fundamental truth about the world. "That's what I thought you were doing," she said, "but I wanted to be sure." As they prepared for sleep that night, Askel found himself thinking about the silver pendant hidden in his quarters. It represented a promise unfulfilled, a future that would never come to pass, a love that had been cut short by circumstances beyond his control. But perhaps, he thought as he listened to Ylsa's steady breathing from her corner, it also represented the possibility of new promises, new futures, new forms of love that could grow in the space left by old losses. The pendant would remain hidden for now, but the possibility it represented was beginning to feel less like a betrayal of the past and more like a hope for the future. The bone needle had been carved from the rib of a whale, its surface polished smooth by generations of skilled hands, and its eye worn wide by countless threads of sinew and wool. It had belonged to Ingrid, Askel's wife, and was perhaps the finest tool of its kind in all of Skarvik, capable of work so delicate that the finished products seemed almost magical in their precision. Now it rested in a small wooden box beside Ylsa's makeshift bed, a gift that carried weight far beyond its practical value. Winter had settled over the fjord with the finality of a grave shroud, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and forbidding. The harbor lay locked in ice thick enough to support a man's weight, while snow drifted against the buildings in shapes that shifted with each new storm. It was during these long, dark months that the true test of any partnership revealed itself, when the constraints of weather and shortened days stripped away all but the most essential interactions. Ylsa had proven herself more than equal to winter's challenges. She had anticipated their needs with remarkable foresight, ensuring that they had adequate stores of food, fuel, and materials to last through the season. More importantly, she had continued to improve in her forge work, mastering techniques that many apprentices took years to learn, but it was in the quieter skills that she truly excelled. Her needlework, guided by the whalebone tool that had once served Askel's wife, produced results that bordered on artistry. She could mend torn leather so expertly that the repair was stronger than the original material, and her ability to create new garments from salvaged fabric had transformed both their wardrobes from merely functional to genuinely well-made. "You have your mother's gift," Askel observed one evening, watching her work intricate patterns into the hem of a new tunic she had crafted for him. Ylsa looked up from her needlework, the bone tool poised between her fingers like a painter's brush. "She taught me that every stitch should serve two purposes: to strengthen the fabric and to bring beauty into the world. She said that life was hard enough without making ugly things when beautiful ones were just as easy to create." A wise woman. She was. Ylsa returned to her work, but he could see her thinking about something more. "Askel, may I ask you something personal?" He set aside the small knife he'd been crafting, a commission from one of the wealthier farmers who appreciated fine metalwork. "You may ask." "I may not answer, but you may ask. Why did you really stop raiding?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. It was not the first time someone had wondered about his retreat from the warrior's life, but it was the first time someone had asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment or fear. "What do you think?" He replied, using a technique she had taught him by example, answering a question with a question to explore the asker's reasoning. Ylsa considered this, her needle moving in steady, precise strokes as she worked. "I think something happened on your last voyage that made you realize the cost was too high. Not the physical cost. You've proven you can handle pain and injury. The cost to your soul." Her insight was closer to the truth than he had expected, and certainly more perceptive than anything the village elders had managed in 5 years of speculation. He found himself wanting to tell her the whole story, the burning monastery, the sound a child made when frightened, the moment when he had looked at his reflection in a pool of blood and no longer recognized the man staring back. There was a village, he said slowly, in Ireland. Small, defenseless, the kind of target we had taken dozens of times before. The raid went according to plan. We took what we came for, left the people alive, as was our custom. But as we were loading the boats, I heard something. He paused, remembering. The sound had been so ordinary, so innocent, that it had cut through the battle rage that usually sustained him during such operations like a blade through silk. A child was singing, he continued. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting in the ruins of what had been her home. She was singing a lullaby, the same melody my own daughter sang when she was frightened or sad. And in that moment, I understood what we really were. Ylsa's needle had stopped moving, though she kept her eyes on her work to give him the privacy of not being watched while he spoke of painful things. We weren't warriors anymore, if we ever had been. We were just men who had become comfortable taking from others what we were too lazy or too frightened to build for ourselves. That little girl's song, it showed me that every village we had raided was someone's home. Every treasure we had taken was something someone else had worked for. Every life we had disrupted belonged to a family like the one I had left behind. So you came home. I came home. But home wasn't the same, and neither was I. The man who had left was different from the one who returned. Ingrid saw it immediately, though she never said anything directly. She just watched me with these careful eyes, like she was trying to decide if I was still the person she had married. And were you? The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. I don't know, he said honestly. I wanted to be. I was trying to be. But then the fever came, and I never had the chance to find out. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of wind through the gaps in the building's walls. Ylsa's needle resumed its steady rhythm, creating patterns that would outlast the fabric they adorned. I think you're a better man now than you were then, she said finally. What makes you say that? Because the man you were then might have taken me in out of pity or guilt or loneliness. The man you are now took me in because you saw that we could help each other become stronger. That's the difference between charity and partnership. Her words struck him with the force of revelation. In all his self-doubt and questioning, he had never considered that his motivations might be not just acceptable, but actually honorable. The idea that his decision to accept Ylsa's offer might represent growth rather than weakness, wisdom rather than sentimentality, was both surprising and deeply comforting. You're very wise for someone who hasn't yet seen 9 winters, he observed. My mother used to say that wisdom isn't about how long you've lived, it's about how carefully you've been paying attention. Ylsa held up the tunic to examine her progress, and he could see that the decorative stitching was indeed becoming something beautiful. Besides, I've had good teachers. Your parents, my parents, yes, but others too. The woman who taught me to read the weather in the behavior of birds. The old fisherman who showed me how to judge the quality of wool by touch alone. The baker who explained why bread needs time to rise properly. She looked at him directly for the first time since their conversation had begun. And a blacksmith who taught me that strength and gentleness aren't opposites. As the evening wound towards sleep, Askel found himself reflecting on the changes that had occurred since Ylsa's arrival. The bone needle she worked with such skill was more than just a tool. It was a bridge between past and present, a connection between the woman who had once used it and the girl who now carried on its work. In her hands, it created beauty and utility in equal measure, proving that the best aspects of those who came before could live on in those who followed. The winter might be long and dark, but in the warm circle of firelight that surrounded them each evening, something precious was growing. Not just the practical partnership they had agreed to, but a deeper connection that neither of them had dared to hope for when their arrangement began. The blood-stained cloakpin lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of Askel's workshop. wrapped in strips of leather that had been soaked in seal oil to keep the metal from rusting. It was a piece of exquisite craftsmanship, worked in gold and set with garnets that caught light like drops of crystallized blood. More importantly, it bore the distinctive knotwork pattern that marked it as belonging to the royal house of Dublin, a prize taken from a dead king's cloak during a raid that had gone catastrophically wrong. It was evidence of a crime that could still bring death to his door, even after all these years of peaceful exile. The revelation came on a morning when the wind had finally begun to carry the scent of spring, when the ice on the harbour had started to show the first hairline cracks that promised eventual release from winter's grip. Ylsa was at the market, trading finished needlework for supplies they would need as the weather warmed. Leaving Askel alone in his workshop for the first time in weeks. He had been repairing the loose floorboard when his hand brushed against the hidden cachie he had forgotten existed. The moment his fingers touched the familiar shape of the pin, memories came flooding back with nauseating clarity. The weight of his axe in his hands, the screams of dying men, the sight of a young Irish king's blood pooling on consecrated ground. "No," he whispered to the empty air, his hands shaking as he unwrapped the pin. "It cannot be." But there was no mistaking the workmanship or the distinctive pattern of garnets set in gold. This was the cloak pin of King Celach of Dublin, the piece he had torn from the dead man's shoulder as Viking steel had carved through Irish flesh like scythe through grain. The raid that had taken this prize had also taken something far more precious. His ability to see himself as anything other than a killer. The sound of approaching footsteps on the path outside sent him scrambling to rewrap the pin and secure it back in its hiding place. By the time Ylsa entered the workshop, he had managed to compose himself enough to appear busy with his legitimate work, though his hands continued to tremble with the force of unwelcome memories. "The baker's wife says there are ships on the horizon," Ylsa announced, setting down her basket and beginning to organize the supplies she had acquired. 3 of them, flying Irish colors. The words hit Askel like a physical blow. Irish ships here, after all these years of peace. It could be coincidence, traders perhaps, or diplomats, seeking to establish new agreements with the Norse settlements. But the timing felt like the work of malevolent gods, coming so soon after he had been forced to confront the evidence of his past crimes. Irish? He tried to keep his voice casual, but Ylsa's sharp eyes missed nothing. Christian ships, according to Gunnar. He's seen their type before. Not traders or raiders, but the kind that carry priests and royal messengers. She paused in her unpacking, studying his face with growing concern. "Askel, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," he admitted, sinking onto the stool beside his anvil. The weight of the secret he carried felt suddenly unbearable, and the prospect of Irish officials arriving in Skarvik made his blood run cold. Ylsa set aside her work entirely and moved to stand beside him, her small hand coming to rest on his arm with a comfort that was both completely natural and utterly foreign to his solitary existence. "Tell me," she said simply, and so he did. The words poured out of him like water through a broken dam. The story of King Celach's death. The brutal efficiency with which they had cut down the Irish Royal Guard. The moment when he had realized that the young king was barely older than Ylsa herself. He told her about the pin he had taken as proof of the kill, about the way the boy king's eyes had remained open even in death, staring accusingly at the grey Irish sky. "It was the moment I knew I had to stop," he concluded, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the forge fire. "Looking at that dead boy, I saw my own daughter's face. I saw what I would become if I continued down that path, and I couldn't bear it." Ylsa listened without interruption, her expression grave, but not shocked. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had revealed. "How long ago?" she asked finally. 9 years. Astrid was still alive then, barely walking. The pin was supposed to be her inheritance, something valuable to provide for her future if anything happened to me. His laugh was bitter. Instead, it became evidence of the kind of man her father really was. "And you think these ships have come looking for justice?" It wasn't a question. Ylsa had grasped the implications immediately, understanding that the arrival of Irish officials so soon after his discovery of the pin could hardly be coincidence. King Shellach had a brother, Askel said, older, more politically minded, the kind of man who might spend years gathering information about his brother's killers, building a case for justice before the High Kings. If he's finally tracked me to Skarvik, he didn't need to finish the thought. They both understood what would happen next. Even if the Irish couldn't force immediate justice, they could make his life impossible, turn the village against him, demand his extradition, or simply put a price on his head that would bring every ambitious warrior in Norway to his door. "What will you do?" Ylsa asked. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications for both their futures. If Askel fled, he would have to leave everything behind, his forge, his home, the life he had built in Skarvik. If he stayed and fought, he would be dragging the entire village into a conflict that wasn't theirs to bear. But there was a third option, one that had only become possible in the months since Ylsa had joined his household. For the first time in years, he had something worth protecting beyond his own life. "I won't run," he said finally. "Running would only confirm their suspicions and put everyone I care about at risk. But I won't simply wait for them to come for me either." "Then what?" Askel looked at her, this remarkable child who had somehow become the center of his world, who had taught him that strength and gentleness could coexist, who had shown him that redemption was possible even for someone with blood on his hands. "I'm going to tell them the truth," he said. "All of it. Who I was, what I did, and who I've become. I'm going to trust that the man I am now is worth more than the crimes of the man I used to be." Ylsa nodded slowly, as if his decision made perfect sense to her. "And if they don't agree?" "Then we'll face whatever comes together." He reached over and covered her small hand with his much larger one. "You and I, we're family now. Families protect each other, no matter what the cost." The words surprised him with their truth. Somewhere in the months they had spent working side by side, learning each other's rhythms, sharing their stories and their silences. They had indeed become family, not by blood or law, but by choice and mutual respect, and the kind of love that grew slowly but rooted deeply. Together, Ylsa agreed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they might be facing. As the afternoon wore on and reports continued to filter in about the approaching ships, Askel found himself thinking about the blood-stained cloak pin hidden beneath his floorboards. It had been a symbol of his guilt for so long, proof of the worst thing he had ever done. But perhaps it could become something else, evidence not just of his crimes, but of his willingness to face the consequences of his past actions. The ships would arrive within days, bringing with them the reckoning he had both dreaded and, in some deep part of himself, longed for. But whatever came next, he would not face it alone. The frightened, guilt-ridden warrior who had taken that pin from a dead boy's cloak was gone, replaced by a man who understood that true strength came not from the ability to deal death, but from the courage to choose life and to protect those who had become precious to him. The twist in his story was complete. The past, he thought safely buried, had returned to demand payment. But the man who would answer that demand was no longer the same person who had committed those long-ago crimes. He was someone new, someone better, someone worth defending, and he would not face the reckoning alone. The iron cross that now lay upon Askel's workbench had been forged in the early hours before dawn, when sleep had proven impossible, and his hands had needed the comfort of familiar work. It was a simple piece, 2 bars of metal joined at right angles and polished to a dull gleam, but it carried the weight of intention and hope. This was to be his offering, his symbol of the man he had become. When the Irish delegation arrived to seek their justice, 3 days had passed since the ships had first been spotted on the horizon. 3 days during which the entire village had transformed from sleepy winter drowsiness into a state of barely controlled anxiety. The Irish delegation had not yet come ashore, instead anchoring their vessels in the deeper water beyond the harbour and sending only small boats to establish preliminary contact with Elder. Thorvald and the other village leaders. The waiting was perhaps worse than immediate confrontation would have been. Each dawn brought the possibility that this would be the day of reckoning. Each sunset the uncertain gift of one more night of peace. Askel found himself torn between the desire to get the encounter over with and the equally strong urge to savor what might be his final days of quiet. Domesticity with Ylsa. She had proven herself remarkably steady during this period of uncertainty. While the other villagers whispered and speculated about what the Irish wanted, she had simply continued with her usual routines, maintaining the forge, preparing their meals, working on her needlework projects with the same meticulous care she brought to everything she did. Her calm pragmatism had become an anchor for Askel's more turbulent emotions. "They'll want to see evidence," she observed on the morning of the fourth day, watching him put the finishing touches on the iron cross. "Proof that you've truly changed. And if they don't believe it, then they're not the kind of people whose opinion matters anyway." She looked up from the leather she was tooling, a new belt to replace the one that had finally worn beyond repair. "But I think they will. Anyone with eyes can see what kind of man you are now." Her confidence in him was both humbling and terrifying. What if she was wrong? What if the years of peaceful living, of honest work and quiet service to his community were not enough to balance the scales of justice? What if the Irish had come not seeking truth, but simply demanding blood for blood? Elder Thorvald's arrival interrupted his brooding. The old man appeared in the doorway of the forge, like a weathered tree bent by too many storms. His expression grave, but not without compassion. "The Irish have requested a formal meeting," he announced without preamble. "Tomorrow at midday in the Great Hall. They want to speak with you specifically, Askel." "Just me?" "They asked for the man called the Bear, who once sailed with Jarl Eric's warband. They seem to know more about your past than I had realized." Thorvald's eyes moved to Ylsa, who had stopped her work to listen, but showed no signs of surprise or fear. "They also asked specifically about your current circumstances, whether you have family, whether you've integrated into the community, whether you follow the Christian faith." The last question made Askel's hand close reflexively around the iron cross. He had indeed been drawn to some of the Christian teachings in recent years, finding in their emphasis on redemption and forgiveness an echo of his own desperate hope for absolution. But he had never formally converted, never undergone baptism or declared himself before witnesses. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That you've been a productive member of our community for 5 years. That you work honestly, keep to yourself, and have recently taken in an orphaned child." Thorvald's gaze moved meaningfully to Ylsa. "That your character has been exemplary in all our dealings." "And how did they respond?" "With interest. They want to meet with you privately first, then hold a public hearing where members of the community can speak on your behalf if they choose to do so." The prospect of a public hearing filled Askel with dread. The idea of having his past crimes aired before neighbors who had come to trust him, of watching their expressions change as they learned what kind of man had been living among them, was almost unbearable. "How many of them are there?" Ylsa asked, her first contribution to the conversation. 6. A monk who serves as their spokesman, 2 warriors who seem to be there for protection, and 3 others who dress like nobles or officials. They speak Norse well enough to conduct business, but they've brought a translator as well. "Do they seem—" Askel struggled to find the right words. "Do they seem like men seeking justice or men seeking revenge?" Thorvald considered this carefully before answering. "They seem like men seeking closure. There's grief there, yes, and anger, but also a weariness that suggests they've carried this burden for a long time. The monk in particular has the look of someone who understands the difference between justice and vengeance." This was encouraging, though Askel knew better than to place too much hope in one man's interpretation of another's intentions. Christian monks could be as bloodthirsty as any warrior when it came to protecting their own interests. After Thorvald left, Askel and Ylsa spent the remainder of the day in quiet preparation. There was little they could do to influence the outcome of tomorrow's meeting, but they could ensure that their affairs were in order, regardless of what transpired. Ylsa had insisted on organizing their household goods, creating neat piles of belongings and labeling them with strips of leather marked in the runic script he had been teaching her. Her efficiency was remarkable, but Askel could see the underlying anxiety in the way she checked and rechecked each arrangement. "If something happens to me," he said finally, unable to bear her silent worry any longer, "Elder Thorvald has promised to see that you're provided for. The baker's wife has said she would welcome your help, and your needlework skills are valuable enough that you could support yourself if necessary." Ylsa looked up from the bundle of tools she had been organizing, her expression fierce in the firelight. "Nothing is going to happen to you." "Ylsa." "No." She stood, crossing to where he sat at his workbench. "I won't listen to you plan for defeat before the battle has even begun. You're not the same man who killed that king. You're not even the same man who came back from that final raid. You've spent 5 years proving that people can change, that redemption is possible, that the past doesn't have to define the future." Her passionate defense of him was deeply moving, but it also highlighted the cruel irony of his situation. In trying to become worthy of her faith in him, he had perhaps set himself up for an even more devastating fall. What if they don't see it that way? Then they're blind. She reached for his hands, her small fingers wrapping around his scarred knuckles. "But they're not blind. They're here seeking answers, not just revenge. If they only wanted blood, they could have sent assassins rather than diplomats." Her logic was sound, but logic had little to do with the fear that gnawed at his insides like a hungry wolf. The prospect of losing everything he had built, his home, his work, his relationship with Ylsa, was almost overwhelming in its intensity. As night fell, and they prepared for what might be their last evening together, Askel found himself studying Ylsa's face in the firelight, memorizing every detail in case tomorrow brought separation they couldn't prevent. She had become so much more than the desperate child who had appeared at his door months ago. She was his daughter in all the ways that mattered, his partner in the work that gave his life meaning, his proof that even the most damaged people could learn to love again. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said as they settled into their respective sleeping spaces, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my adult life. You saved me, Ylsa, not just from loneliness, but from the belief that I was beyond redemption." "You saved yourself," she replied softly. "I just helped you remember who you really were underneath all that guilt and grief." As sleep finally claimed him in the early hours of morning, Askel's last conscious thought was a prayer to whatever gods or saints might be listening, not for his own salvation, but for Ylsa's continued safety and happiness, regardless of what the new day might bring. He had faced many battles in his lifetime, but none had ever carried stakes as high as the confrontation that awaited him with the dawn. The golden ring that Brother Columba wore on his right hand caught the morning light streaming through the great hall's windows, its surface inscribed with Latin words that spoke of faith, hope, and charity. It had belonged to his younger brother, King Kellach of Dublin, and had been placed on the monk's finger by dying hands as the young king breathed his last in an Irish monastery surrounded by the aftermath of Viking steel and Christian prayers for the dead. The great hall of Skarvik had never hosted such a formal gathering. Built for feast days and seasonal celebrations, it now served as a court of justice, with wooden benches arranged to face a high table where the Irish delegation sat in solemn array. Brother Columba occupied the center position, his monk's robes a stark contrast to the rich clothing of his companions, his thin face bearing the weight of years spent seeking answers to questions that had consumed him. Askel entered the hall. With measured steps, Ylsa walking beside him despite protests from several villagers that this was no place for a child. Her presence at his side was both comfort and terror. Comfort because her steady courage strengthened his own resolve. Terror because her association with him might taint her forever in the eyes of those who would judge them both. The villagers. who had gathered to witness the proceedings, fell silent as Askel approached the high table. He could feel their eyes upon him, these neighbors who had known him as a quiet craftsman, now learning that they had been living alongside a man whose past was written in blood and violence. Some faces showed shock, others fear, but a surprising number reflected something that might have been understanding, even sympathy. Elder Thorvald stood to make the formal introductions, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony and ancient custom. Brother Columba of the monastery at Glendaluch, we present Askel Eriksson, called the Bear, smith of Skarvik and guardian of the child Ylsa Bjorn's daughter. The monk studied Askel with eyes that seemed to see past flesh and bone to the soul beneath. When he spoke, his Norse was accented, but clear, marked by years of study and diplomatic necessity. Askel Eriksson, you stand accused of participation in the raid that resulted in the death of King Selleck of Dublin, my brother in blood and in Christ. Do you acknowledge this charge? The moment of truth had arrived. Askel could feel the collective held breath of everyone present, could sense Ylsa's small hand finding his in a gesture of support that gave him strength. I do, he replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. A murmur ran through the assembled villagers, though whether of surprise or confirmation, he could not tell. Brother Columba nodded slowly, as if this honesty was both expected and appreciated. Will you tell us in your own words what transpired? On that day 9 years passed. Askel closed his eyes briefly, calling up memories he had spent years trying to bury. When he spoke, it was with the careful precision of someone who understood that truth, however painful, was his only path to redemption. We came to your brother's stronghold seeking gold and silver, as was our way in those days. The resistance was lighter than expected. Most of the warriors were away on some errand of their own. Your brother died defending his people, sword in hand, fighting with courage that would have honored any warrior's hall. And you killed him. I did. The admission fell into the silence like a stone into still water. I struck him down with my axe when he stood between me and the treasure we had come to claim. Brother Columba's hand moved unconsciously to the golden ring, his fingers turning it in a gesture that spoke of long-practiced grief. He was 22 years old, the monk said quietly. He had been king for less than a year, chosen by the nobles because they believed his youth and idealism could bring peace to our troubled land. He had never led a raid against your people, never raised a sword, except in defense of his own holdings. Each word was a weight added to the scales of justice, each detail a reminder of the life that had been cut short by Viking steel. Askel felt the full force of what he had taken from the world, not just a life, but all the possibilities that life might have contained. I know, he said simply. I have carried the weight of his death for 9 years, along with the deaths of all the others who fell that day. It is a burden that has shaped every choice I have made since. Has it indeed? Brother Columba leaned forward, his gaze intensifying. Tell me, Askel Eriksson, what manner of choices have you made? This was the question Askel had been preparing for, the moment when he would have to justify not just his past actions, but his present existence. He looked around the hall, seeing faces he had come to know and respect, people whose tools he had repaired, whose problems he had helped solve in the quiet ways that neighbors assist one another. I chose to lay down my weapons, he began. I chose to leave the raiding life forever, to find a way of living that created rather than destroyed. I chose to serve this community with my skills, to earn my place through honest work rather than taking what others had built. And the child? Brother Columba's eyes moved to Ylsa, who stood straight and unafraid, despite the enormity of the proceedings. What place does she hold in these choices you have made? Askel felt his heart swell with pride and protective love, as he looked down at the remarkable girl who had become his daughter in all but blood. She is my redemption, he said simply, and my hope for the future. The wooden hammer that Elder Thorvald held was carved from ash wood, blessed by 3 generations of village leaders, its head worn smooth by decades of use in settling disputes and rendering judgment. It had never been used for a case with stakes this high, had never been called upon to weigh the balance between justice and mercy, between the demands of the past and the possibilities of the future. Now it rested on the table before him as the testimonies that would determine Askel's fate began to unfold. Brother Columba had asked to hear from members of the community, to understand what manner of man the killer of his brother had become. The response had surprised everyone, including Askel himself. Rather than the handful of obligatory supporters, he had expected nearly every adult in Skarvik had requested permission to speak. Gunnar the fisherman was the first to stand, his weathered hands clasped before him as he addressed the Irish delegation with the careful dignity of a man who understood the weight of his words. "I have known Askel for 5 years," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "In all that time, I have never seen him raise his hand in anger, never heard him speak with cruelty or malice. When my nets were damaged in a storm and I had no coin to pay for repairs, he fixed them for the promise of future payment. When that payment was delayed by a poor fishing season, he waited without complaint. The baker's wife Astrid rose next. My youngest son fell through the ice 2 winters past. Askel pulled him from the water and carried him to warmth, then refused any payment for what he called a neighbor's duty. The boy lives because of his quick action and his knowledge of how to treat the cold sickness. One by one, they came forward, farmers whose tools had been mended, women whose husbands had received help with heavy labor, children who had been treated with patient kindness. Each testimony painted a picture of a man who had become integral to the community's well-being, who had earned respect through consistent service and quiet generosity. But it was Elder Thorvald's words that carried the most weight, spoken with the authority of age and long observation. "I have served this village for 30 years, the old man said, his hand resting on the ceremonial hammer. "I have seen men of all kinds, some born to kindness, others twisted by circumstance. Askel came to us as a stranger carrying wounds deeper than any blade could inflict. He asked for nothing but the right to work in peace. In return, he has given us 5 years of faithful service, honest dealing and genuine care for our welfare." Thorvald paused, his eyes moving to where Ylsa stood beside Askel, her small hand still clasped in his much larger one. But perhaps most telling of all is what he has done for this child. When no one else would take her in, when the community had failed in its duty to protect one of its most vulnerable members, Askel opened his home and his heart. He has raised her with wisdom and kindness, taught her valuable skills, and given her the greatest gift any adult can give a child, the knowledge that she is valued and loved. The silence that followed Thorvald's words was profound. Heavy with the weight of collective judgment, Brother Columba had listened to each testimony with careful attention, his expression revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. Now he stood, the golden ring catching the light as he clasped his hands before him. "Askel Eriksson," he said formally, "you have heard the testimony of your neighbors. You have seen how they regard you, how they value your contribution to their lives. Does this community support represent your true character, or is it merely the successful deception of a man hiding from his crimes?" The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Askel felt the weight of every eye upon him, felt the collective hope and fear of people who had come to care for him despite his past. "I believe it represents who I have become," he said carefully. "Not who I was, but who I chose to become when I realized that the man I had been was not someone I could live with. And what of justice for my brother?" Brother Columba's voice carried pain that 9 years had not diminished. What of the life he might have lived, the good he might have done, the children he might have fathered? How does your transformation balance those scales? It was the question Askel had dreaded most, the one for which he had no adequate answer. How could any amount of good work, any depth of genuine change, restore a life that had been taken. How could redemption be anything more than a comfortable lie when the consequences of past actions were irreversible? It cannot, he admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of absolute honesty. Nothing I do can bring back your brother or undo the harm I caused. All I can offer is the promise that the man who killed him is gone, replaced by someone who spends every day trying to earn the right to exist in a world made poorer by his past actions. Brother Columba nodded slowly, as if this admission of inadequacy was somehow exactly what he had hoped to hear. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small object wrapped in white cloth. "There is one more piece of evidence to consider," he said, beginning to unwrap the object with ceremonial care. "One final testament to the man my brother was, and perhaps to the man you have become." The small leather journal that Brother Columba unwrapped with reverent care was bound with brass clasps tarnished green with age, its pages filled with careful script in both Latin and Irish. It had belonged to King Chelach, discovered among his possessions after his death, filled with thoughts and observations about leadership, justice, and the possibility of peace between Christian and pagan peoples. On the final page, written the night before the raid that would claim his life, were words that would transform this moment from judgment to something approaching grace. "My brother wrote in his journal every day," Brother Columba said, his voice softer now, touched with the tenderness that grief sometimes wore when it had aged into acceptance. Even on campaign, even when the burdens of kingship pressed heavy upon his shoulders, he recorded his thoughts about the world he hoped to help create. He opened the journal to a page marked with a strip of faded ribbon, his eyes scanning words he had clearly read countless times before. On the last night of his life, he wrote these words: "Tomorrow we may face raiders from the north, men who see us as nothing more than sources of wealth to be plundered. But I have been thinking about what Father Brendan taught us, that every man carries within him the capacity for both great evil and great good. Perhaps the raiders believe they have no choice but violence, just as we believe we have no choice but to resist them. I wonder what might happen if someone were brave enough to choose a different path, to break the endless cycle of violence and revenge that keeps our peoples at war." The hall was utterly silent as Brother Columba continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I have decided that if God grants me victory tomorrow, I will try to find a way to speak with our enemies rather than simply drive them off. Perhaps understanding can grow where hatred once flourished. Perhaps even the most hardened warrior might discover that there are better ways to live than by the sword alone." Brother Columba closed the journal and looked directly at Askel, and for the first time since the proceedings began, there was something other than grief in his eyes. "My brother never had the chance to attempt that conversation," he said, "but it seems that God, in his mysterious wisdom, has provided another opportunity for such understanding to flourish." Askel felt his knees weaken with the force of unexpected hope. "Brother Columba, let me finish," the monk said gently. "When we learned of your location and circumstances, when we heard the testimonies of your neighbors and saw the evidence of the life you have built, I began to wonder if perhaps my brother's final prayer had been answered in a way none of us expected. Perhaps the path to peace he envisioned has been walked by the very man who ended his earthly journey." Ylsa's hand tightened in Askel's, and he could feel the collective held breath of everyone present. "The law demands justice for my brother's death," Brother Columba continued. "But justice is not always the same thing as vengeance. True justice seeks to restore balance to the world, to repair what has been broken, to ensure that harm leads ultimately to healing." He stood and walked around the table to stand directly before Askel, the journal still clutched in his hands. "I have seen the balance you have restored through your service to this community. I have heard the testimony of those whose lives you have touched with kindness and skill. I have witnessed the love between you and this child, and I understand that some bonds transcend blood and circumstance." Brother Columba reached out and placed his hand on Askel's shoulder, the gesture carrying weight that seemed to encompass forgiveness. blessing and the promise of redemption earned. In my brother's name, and in service to the God who teaches us that no sinner is beyond salvation, I declare that justice has been served, not through punishment but through transformation, not through payment of blood, but through dedication to life. The hall erupted in voices, some cheering, others weeping, all expressing the profound relief that came when mercy triumphed over the darker impulses of human nature. Askel felt tears streaming down his face, 9 years of guilt and fear finally releasing their hold on his heart. But it was Ylsa's voice that cut through the noise, clear and strong and filled with fierce pride. "I told you so," she said, looking up at him with eyes that sparkled with tears and laughter. "I told you they would see who you really are." As the formal proceedings concluded and the hall began to empty, Brother Columba approached them once more, this time carrying himself less like a judge and more like a friend. "There is one more thing," he said to Askel. "My brother's journal speaks often of his desire to learn more about Norse craftsmanship, particularly metalworking. He believed that trade and cultural exchange were better foundations for relationships between our peoples than warfare. Perhaps, when you are ready, you might consider taking on Irish apprentices, sharing your knowledge in service of the peace he dreamed of." Askel nodded, his throat too tight for immediate speech. Finally he managed, "I would be honored." As spring settled fully over Skarvik and the Irish ships prepared for their journey home, Askel and Ylsa returned to their forge, their routine, their quiet life together. But everything had changed. The weight of hidden guilt was gone, replaced by the lightness that came with genuine forgiveness and the knowledge that redemption was not just possible, but real. In the evenings, as they sat by their fire, Ylsa working her intricate needlework and Askel maintaining his tools, they would sometimes speak of the future, of the apprentices who might come from Ireland to learn the smith's craft, of the bridges that could be built between peoples who had known only conflict, of the children who might grow up in a world where understanding had replaced fear. "You saved me," Askel said one evening, watching her fingers work their magic with needle and thread. "We saved each other," she replied, not looking up from her work but smiling nonetheless. That's what families do. And in that simple exchange, in the warmth of the fire and the comfort of shared purpose, Askel understood that his story had found its proper ending, not with the violence that had defined his youth, but with the love that would shape his remaining years.